Hello and welcome to this video series where I will be investigating how landscape and nature is treated in video games. My name is Alistair Grant and I'll be your guide through the wilderness, so please feel free to picture me as some kind of benevolent satyr. You know, those kind of half goat, half human things that would fit right into almost any landscape. I say treated because nature could be used simply as a backdrop, a kind of veneer setting, or it could be fundamentally tied to its design and experience. I'll be looking at how you inhabit these digital environments through different perspectives that games can afford the player. First person, third person, side-scrolling, top-down, etc. And also their interactivity. So gameplay loops that exist in these environments and the player experience. I'm also looking at methods of presentation, like photoreal representations to highly stylized graphics, and looking into some of the contemporary game-making practices and development techniques used to realize them, taking examples from across the industry, so big AAA games down to smaller indie teams and solo projects. I'll be doing comparisons between games, and also hopefully this will be a bit of a celebration of how bizarre games are. At the time of making this first video, I'm actually not sure how many I'm going to make in total because the list of games that I want to talk about keeps growing, so I'm just going to keep it open-ended. Just to introduce myself, I'm a contemporary artist working in the fields of sculpture, digital, installation, performance and video games, based across Glasgow and Edinburgh. In Glasgow, I'm currently on the MFA course at Glasgow School of Art, and in Edinburgh I run the Number Shop Studios and Gallery, which I set up in 2014 and continue to direct. Last year I also co-established Edinburgh Contemporary Art Directory. This video sits within my project titled Memories of Green, which emerged from group micro-residencies to the Orkney Isles called Odyssean in 2015 and 2016 with Alexander Stevenson, Natasha Rosling and Simon Lee Dicker. At the time of making this video, we're currently exhibiting at Hesticum in Somerset. Memories of Green is a project rooted in questions surrounding landscape and technology. Specifically how we inhabit nature or natural spaces from a distance, using technology as an interface or potentially a complete replacement, looking at the dynamic between the original physical or digital copy of something, which of the two is more powerful or holds the most value or potential. I'm looking at how a technology-based relationship warps the experience of being in a nature space, granting a kind of distorted sense of presence with sensory inputs being just visual and oral, removing the equally important senses of smell and tactile sensation. These thoughts are flowing through my exhibited work, Moving Swiftly Onwards, in which the sounds from my reference videos, exploring the Hesticum Gardens, was synchronized with the animation of those movements. And the physical Jesmonite sculpture casts are based off what were originally digital sketches. So I'm interested in making the physical and digital spaces more permeable. To assist this discussion and keep me on track with my digital wanderings, I've the good fortune of being able to call on the expertise of Dr. William Huber. William is head of the Division of Games and Arts at Abertay University in Dundee, which, if you're not aware, is like the leading school in the UK for games, so, you know, he's really good and smart. We had a really great chat, and from that we established some parameters and useful terminology as a way to structure my thinking. So to start off with, it's worth acknowledging that nature and landscape as terms are kind of problematic. Is a tilled field still nature? Or a roll of turf that's unravelled on top of tarmac? Does nature disappear when in contact with humanity? What and where are the boundaries? William had some insight into a potential zeitgeist or theme. Some interesting aesthetics of nature that you're finding in games and VR projects especially is what I call a new pastoralism. Technically, it's not literary pastoralism, which is usually about actual shepherds. This is about a bucolic lifestyle. This is more a restoration of an Edenic whole, and it's most contradictory to me. William then goes on to say, when VR technology is demoed by placing the viewer in some sort of bucolic setting with the stream and trees, but to do so you're required to use this apparatus made with plastic and combat metals. It's destroying that which it represents in order to create the representation. So I do want to keep this dichotomy in mind. It's interesting that the means through which you access these spaces are also their antithesis. Specificity, when I use it here, is referring to an indexical approach. Games are able to recreate or reproduce a location based on real-world measurements. Google Maps, photogrammetry, for example. Developers pull their visual references and audio directly from reality anyway, but games with specificity in mind are grounded in their source material. They build on top of it, developing a kind of semi-fiction. They could end up with a photoreal simulation aesthetic, or it could be visually abstract, but with a highly personal story. Examples being Walden, the video game, based off the text by Henry David Thoreau, and with its visual references and audio captured at Walden Pond itself, and a field recording is indexical. B-Swing by Jack King Spooner, which is about growing up in his rural village in Scotland, so that's a highly personal and location-specific narrative. And Every Tree Different mod for the 2011 open-world game Skyrim replaces all the tree models in the game with textures from real trees in Nordic Finnish forests that the creator would document whilst out walking. Evocative or iconic is maybe more straightforward to describe. It's an abstraction of what we know as real nature, and most games would be in this category. Potentially more simplified, reduced and fictionalized in an attempt to recall or suggest real-world flora and fauna without being burdened by the laws of real-world ecology. For example, this plant can grow anywhere in this game world because I just made it up, that kind of thing. I mean, it's a useful and economic shorthand for communicating things that need not be more complicated. When referring to some of the games we were talking about, William commented that one of the tensions that appear in these works are the difference between the indexical and the iconic, because especially abstracted digital graphics are by their nature iconic. They refer to the category of things. Anyways, enough intro stuff, and on to the first game. Proteus is an indie game developed by Ed Key and David Kanaga, released in 2013 across PC, Mac, PlayStation 3 and slightly later on Sony's PlayStation Vita handheld. It's a single-player, first-person perspective game where there is minimal or non-traditional interactivity. I say minimal interactivity because it's not often you have a game where there are no inputs beyond your left analog stick controlling where you move and the right analog stick controlling where you look. You move and you observe in this game. That is how seemingly straightforward it is, but that simplicity leaves space for a pretty complex player experience. What I mean by non-traditional interactivity is that you inhabit this abstracted natural space, and as you move through it, you trigger proximity-based sound tied to objects that form part of its soundscape. This happens in other games to lesser degrees quite frequently, but by stripping away other interactivity in the game, it brings this subtle mechanic to the forefront of the experience. Once you realise you're playing a soundscape, that then in turn negates and influences your movement across the island. You start looking for the xylophone spring of a frog to sit on top of the synths. You might hang around with the crabs in their muddy, warm, offbeat clicking, and you might chase sparkling chickens into the sea. Ian Bogos refers to playing Proteus as a kind of safari, in which eventually patterns emerge, or rather, you become able to produce sonic patterns by orchestrating your movements. Proteus is an island you tune like a radio, or maybe a radio that looks like an island. In terms of game structure, a full play session from start to finish can take 30 minutes if you go quickly to an hour if you hang around. You start the game in spring, then you move through to summer, autumn, and the game finishes in winter. Each season exists as a single day-night cycle. The night cycle is where you're teleported into the next season with its new soundscape and colour palette. So the 4 seasons are distinct and compartmentalised rather than entwined and undefined as in reality. But the game uses this to great effect. In a Rock Paper Shotgun article, Alice O'Connor said, "Proteus captures one of my favourite things about walking, about getting to know a place and seeing it change over time. You gravitate towards the high ground to get a lay of the land. Then you might approach points of interest like the fort, the big tree, the circle of figures. Through the seasons you revisit these places, and if you're patient you uncover some secrets. For me, the separation helps to precisely evoke each season in a microcosm. I find myself thinking about how good that other season was when you're in the one you're in. Then when you're in that other one, you think about the other one again. It does have moments where you recognise its distinct beauty, and that it is of that specific time. Like when you see a season at its peak, the most itself it can be. The procedural generation of the island means that it's a place designed to return to more than once, as starting a game generates a new island layout. So it's like a little nature pod, escape pod that you can get a fix with after work or before dinner. Like it's bite size. When the game released in 2013, it won awards and also had a controversial reception, which is amusing for a game so cute, as it was birthed into the existing discussion around what games can be following the 2012 release of Dear Esther. Dear Esther is a narrative-driven, first-person exploration game from which the term walking simulator was popularised. A kind of sneering, dismissive insult initially given by players/morons who believe that these art things are fundamentally not games, even if they do exist on a PlayStation 3. Or, more subjectively, that by design they are inherently boring. I don't want to labour this point or retread well-trodden ground, so I may as well get this out the way in the first video. But some of the games I will be covering fall into this kind of category. Also, I do want to talk about traversal in this series. It did raise questions around whether games like Proteus failed to capitalise on the core potentials of an interactive medium, and what design priorities games should have. But after the quarrel subsided, the indie scene continued to make these kinds of games, acknowledging that subtle mechanics are still mechanics. The term walking simulator has softened and been reclaimed in recent years, and it's worn as a badge of pride by some games and designers. I've found what I think is a strong contemporary interpretation from Levi Rubeck. Walking simulator is a reclamation of the positive aspects of walking, especially in a Robert Frost sense. Active participation in an outside world through the senses, rather than creation, destruction, colonisation. A habitation of space where so many other games have to incentivise the player into interacting with the high-resolution worlds they've moulded, because they are otherwise zipping through so fast that details minor and major leave no lasting impact. Walking is all about taking a place in a world, not taking over that world. And since video games establish so many fantastic worlds, there should be no shame in embracing one small but sensitive position in them. This statement chimes well with something William picked up on in our conversation. That relationship between sound and image, Those more pastoral art-facing projects like Proteus or Beastwing or Dear Esther is when they have the more stylized, more abstracted, low-res, low-poly graphics, but they have the very intimate sound engineering, which is the inverse of the AAA approach. In AAA you have these visual environments where a lot of labour has gone into them, but usually the sound libraries are very generic. A footstep here is a footstep anywhere. And for me it's that exact inhabiting, a sense of immersion and place and space that games do so well. I would say games are the perfect, if not only, art form able to explore those contemplative and nostalgic spaces. Games can put you there. Simulator is kind of a silly term for this game anyway, as simulation implies a mirror of reality, whereas this is quite clearly, from the very moment we opened our big singular eye, an evocative, iconic abstraction of reality. It's a ludicrous fictive space. In terms of its presentation, you have this curious lo-fi and vibrant pixel art style with block colours and pastel shades. Its graphics are 2D planes set within 3D space, so this means it communicates in the most economical and efficient way. For example, waves being represented by simple expanding and contracting white lines. Because the world is untextured and unlit, meaning the 2D planes do not cast shadows, you can communicate the form and volume of a tree trunk with a few perpendicular 2D planes, instead of a complicated 3D skin formed of hundreds of triangles, or thousands, and high-resolution textures. Also, 2D face-me objects mean that everything has a clear, identifiable silhouette at all times. And that's an interesting thing in itself. Many of the objects in the game orient themselves according to the player's position. The player observes them as they observe the player. Of all the games I'll talk about, this will probably be up there in terms of its presentation being furthest away from actual reality, but it's easily got the most charm and character, and it's distinctive. The reduced visual noise and information means that the differing seasons really have a distinct feel. It's not often you visit an environment in a game and for it to have a completely different emotional flavour. I mean, winter feels absolutely desolate, haunting, cold, and really beautiful. Importantly, I think the throwback, retro aesthetic choices have resulted in this game having longevity. It looks great now, and I think it'll look great forever, which is not something you can easily say about 3D games, which have quite a short, palatable shelf life. As Ian Bogos writes in his review 3 Ways on Proteus, video games are narcissistic. They are about you even when they put you in someone else's shoes. We may think we play video games to be someone, or something else, but inevitably we do so to be ourselves as well. So on that note, what was I thinking about whilst I was walking in this world? Well, because of its minimalism, it puts most of the gameplay experience back on you, back into your mind. When I go on a walk, I rarely if ever actually interact with the landscape beyond putting my feet down on it. I know for certain that I cannot dig a hole in Proteus, but I know that I can do that if I really wanted to in reality. I guess the knowledge that there is inherent potential for destruction and creation is important. In Proteus there is a tinge of frustration in constantly being reminded that you are just an observer, or at best a passive participant. I just can't help but want to get more involved, even after many playthroughs. Bogos poses that there is no you in Proteus, at least not in the way you thought there was. There is only an island. The experience you have on the island isn't an experience on an island at all. Instead, it's an experience of an island's experience. Proteus is a game about being an island instead of a game about being on one. Just like how your headspace changes the experience of walking in the physical world, the Proteus experience changes from playthrough to playthrough, and from person to person. You may come to it a different version of you. Sometimes you'll have a busy mind when walking and find yourself walking fast and thinking ahead, or there could be a surprising amount of nothing going on in that grey mush box. You could be distant daydreaming, or very present and in the immediate moment. Because of the game's ethereal malleability, I'm not sure it's the kind of game where you can come away having a definitive take on it. If you were to review it, you are kind of reviewing your mentality at the time of being in it. Because of the way in which it gives space for contemplation, it does feel quite similar to visiting a visual art exhibition. Maybe minimalism and impressionism, which seems obvious, I guess, because it's kind of both of those. The feeling I get of playing it is one of a quiet, relaxing melancholy. The single-player nature of it, observing natural phenomena on your own, the fact that everything retreats from you. On approach, things either run away from you or dart underground. For me, that's pretty disheartening. I guess it does need to happen though, as if all the critters just hung around you, you'd probably just get frustrated at not being able to interact with them. But it feels like you're trying to catch them, so you can almost role-play a mechanic that doesn't actually exist, because you can't actually catch them. By chasing them, that again loops back into the traversal and movement through the soundscape. When this released, I remember showing this to as many people as possible, putting it up on a projector in art school before a gig, maybe subconsciously hoping this kind of exposure to something more experimental might help get more people into games. I felt and still feel like it's a special game that cuts against the more aggressive and fairly rotten cores of many popular games and their respective followings. I'd like to leave you with the thought of looking at the island top down and watching the player position move over the surface of the island, conducting an electronic symphony determined by curiosity.